There are many political expressions that we have lost the original meaning of. We don't know gerrymandering or filibuster except in their current political context. We don't know about the origins of an old Massachusetts politician or a bunch of Spanish pirates that led to these names. It's lost on us now. Coattails, as a political expression, as in winning on the coattails of a presidential candidate, is not such an expression. It's fairly easy, however amusing it might be, to picture the long coat of a great man and many congressmen pulling in after him. When Andrew Jackson was elected president, the coattails were obvious. He was the people's president, he said. He had a mandate, and he was going to use it. In a symbol of that mandate, what happened in the election of 1828, when the first Western president was elected, thousands of people descended upon Washington for his inauguration ceremonies. I have never seen such a crowd before, said Daniel Webster. Persons have come 500 miles to see General Jackson, and they really think the country has been saved from some dreadful danger. The crowd swarmed the steps of the Congress, and it was necessary for a cable to be strewn so that there could be a place for the inauguration ceremony to take place. 15,000 people watched the same man who had sworn in Thomas Jefferson, John Marshall, the Chief Justice of the United States, administer the oath to Jackson. Then following a short speech, Jackson's carriage, which was lined by Revolutionary War soldiers as an honor guard, went down Pennsylvania Avenue to claim the executive mansion. It's a ceremony that's replicated today every time there's a new president, with only in recent memory Jimmy Carter changing it up a bit by leaving his carriage, his limo that is, and walking down Pennsylvania Avenue for a piece, which now almost all presidents are obliged to do a little of. When he got to the mansion, arrangements were made so that Jackson could shake hands with many of the citizens who had come to see him. But there was such a crowd and such a press of men that some of his armed guards had to stand around Jackson just so he wouldn't be crushed by the crowd. Eventually he had to flee the White House and went to his lodgings in a nearby hotel. And in what was called the reign of King Mob by some, thousands of people stayed around the executive mansion looking for food, liquor, ice cream, and a party. It was thought to be an inauspicious beginning for a presidency, but by the next day mostly the crowd had left, and Jackson returned to the executive mansion and began to run the country. The crowd that he brought in mirrored what was going on in the congressional election which accompanied the presidential election of 1828. Even as a candidate in the disputed election of 1824, which he lost to John Quincy Adams, Jackson brought 33 new House members who were aligned to him into the Congress, although he would not assume the presidency that year. And so as the winner in 1828, it was no surprise that he would get even more, 23 more seats, Jacksonians, meaning Democrats would have 136 seats, 68% of the House, and enough to pass the legislation he wanted. When his loyal Veep, Martin Van Buren, won the White House, however, there was a dangerous omen around the celebration. Van Buren won. He beat his opponents. But at the same time, Democrats lost 15 seats in the House to the new Whig Party, a party that would, 4 years later, defeat Van Buren, and in that election of 1840, as President William Henry Harrison was elected, 33 Whig congressmen would be pulled on his coattails with him, enough to control 58% of the House and reverse the situation of 1828. Jackson and Harrison echoed the great coattails of Thomas Jefferson in 1800, called the Revolution of 1800 by his supporters, bringing the government to a small government approach and rejecting federalism in its largest extremes. 22 seats were won by Jeffersonians when he won that election of 1800. John Adams The president and his opponent in the 1800 election had won in his election, 1796, along with 10 Federalists, enough for narrow control of the House. We had a little bit of coattails. But 1800 was different. 68% of the House now supported Jefferson, and Jefferson would affect national policy as he saw it. And Jeffersonian Republicans would control the White House for 2 presidencies after him, that of Madison and Monroe. But for a blip in 1812, the Federalist Party in America, the party that Jefferson had defeated in 1800, was eliminated as a political force, both by political contest and by Jefferson's cleverness in plucking away their best ideas. Coattails the number of House seats, and to a limited degree Senate seats. That body is much more difficult to measure, that a president brings in when they win election or re-election is almost a perfect sign of a strong presidency or a weak presidency. Franklin Roosevelt was the coattail king, earning 97 seats for his party, 71% of the House for Democrats, the best coattail performance ever by a president. In his next 3 elections, he would gain for his party 15, 5, and then 20 seats as he won re-election each time. Not surprisingly, for a lot of his presidency, Franklin Roosevelt got what he wanted. When he didn't, he cajoled where he could, threatened where he needed to, vetoed where he had to, and sometimes used his appearances at political events to indicate his support to other voters. Early in his presidency, when he submitted a fairly unpopular bill, one that would reduce payments for veterans and introduce economy into the government, a lot of the New Deal congressmen elected with him didn't want to vote for it. All one congressman had to say to his other members was, "Gentlemen, tomorrow Franklin Roosevelt will be reading the Congressional Register, and the president will see who is with him." His bill passed. Even Republicans voted for the bill. By contrast, Grover Cleveland, the first Democrat elected after the Civil War, had no coattails. He won a narrow victory, and only won by winning New York narrowly. He won the presidency while his party, the Democrats, lost 20 seats. They still had a majority in the House, but many of those Democrats were from silver states or from Tammany Hall or other boss-controlled areas. And Grover Cleveland, Grover the Honest, would argue with bosses and have some trouble there, and he was against silver money. As a result, Grover Cleveland's results as president would be mixed, and he would lose the presidency in 1888. When he regained the presidency in 1892, the only person to do so after losing the White House and handing it over, he had no coattails again. Republicans gained seats in the House. This added to his tumultuous second presidency, which was worse for him than the first term. On his one major issue that he ran on in 1892, the tariff, there weren't enough Democratic congressmen to pass substantial change. Presidents like Cleveland, candidates who win narrow victory, generally don't carry a big coattail into the House. John F. Kennedy had a very close race in 1960, and as a result, only brought in one Democratic congressman along with him. Jimmy Carter had an extremely close race, and he, too, only brought in one Democratic congressman into the House. Nixon in 1968 brought in only 5 congressmen. By contrast, Reagan, winning big in 1980, brought in 34 new Republicans, and LBJ about the same number in 1964. These presidents, once in, had done 2 distinct things. One, they decimated the ranks of the opposition party, instilling fear in them. And 2, they brought in new partisans of their own party, House members, instilling respect and maybe a little fear in these new members and some of the old ones, at least for the first 2 years. Reagan could demand what was at the time a radical tax cut out of the new Congress, even though it was controlled by Democrats. Lyndon Johnson, out of his new Democratic Congress, got Medicare and some Great Society programs and new voting right protections. Part of the explanation for the Coattails effect is found in the Constitution. It's not so much that the Constitutional Convention planned a coattail effect, but the mechanisms that allows it to take place was the result of certain designs they had. The House was to be as close to the people as possible. This was the people's body. And they would have elections every 2 years. That was almost a unanimous agreement in a constitutional convention that agreed on little else. They wanted the legislature, the House of Representatives, to be most representative. This makes congressmen necessarily more focused on their little district, their local area. They're more provincial. They're even nervous, one might say. Every other year, they will face the consequences of what they have done. If a president is popular enough to give them cover, fine. They might take the plunge. In fact, they might even demand that the president allow them to be seen as with him, if a president is popular. But if the president offers them little to help them in their election, which is coming up, they'll think about that election, which is often a matter of months away. This even applies to bipartisan negotiations. Franklin Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan could always do better with reaching out across the aisle than a president like Jimmy Carter did, even though all three of these presidents made reaching out to the other side a bit of a priority for them. In the case of FDR and Reagan, some percentage of these congressmen's voters voted for the president. And if you were a Republican congressman in the 30s, Franklin Roosevelt was president, grabbing that reached hand from the chief executive may help you in a district where many voters were voting Democrat. And we all know about both the Reagan Democrats, Democratic voters, Union men who turned and voted for Reagan, and the Blue Dog, or as they were called then, Boll Weevil Democrats, who were Democrats in the South who often voted with Reagan and conducted very often separate negotiations with the White House, instrumental in passing Reagan's agenda. But there were no Carter Republicans, and there were few Kennedy Republicans. Clinton also was hurt by low coattails in both his election and his re-election, which meant that he dragged in few partisans. There were few Clinton Republicans. And he put fear in the hearts of few Republicans. George W. Bush was also a low coattail president, though he did make significant gains in the 2002 midterms that helped to secure his control over the Congress. He didn't earn them when he was running. Both the 2000-2004 elections, there were no coattails. The question in this election is, will there be coattails? One thing's clear. While the presidential race still has some chance of reversal, the House race is decided. Democrats will hold the House and gain seats. This is the consensus of experts and even some in the Republican Congressional Campaign Committee. More than a few congressmen will be looking at whether Obama carried their district and what the margin of victory was. History shows that it's not just winning a presidential race that's important in American politics. Though the presidency is powerful, and though winning the presidential election certainly is important. But history shows how much you win by is also very important, and what your coattails are. As the coattails of a president is one of the best predictors of presidential success in the American system. With history beating up politics, I'm Bruce Carlson. I want to thank you for listening. The website is myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.com. As we're entering the last days of the election, I wanted to put in another plug for the audiobook, History Picks the President 2008. It's a look at all of the different factors that people have looked at when trying to predict a presidential race, say the nation at war, who controls the House, the vice presidential picks, age in the presidency, whether there's party unity within the party, and what's the impact of an incumbent president on a candidate. All of these things we take a look at. And I do make a prediction in that audiobook, and this was an audiobook that was put together in about June, and I think the prediction is fairly well holding out. But it's not so much, I like to say, that the destination, but it's the journey there. I think it's a book that probably will have a lot to say even after the election, because it's sort of looking at these various factors and going through the different stories of American presidential elections past. So it's a tool for you to understand presidential politics better, and it's available on the website myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.com. Thanks for listening.